I was sitting across from Victor at Mr. Ellison's desk when he said it. Calm as you please, like he was ordering coffee, that Clara's pension money should go to him, not me. That I didn't need it. That he'd handle everything from here. The words hung in that quiet office like smoke, and for just a moment I couldn't breathe. My sister had been gone 3 weeks, and here was her husband of 42 years, the man who'd stood beside her casket and cried into his handkerchief, telling me with that thin smile of his that I was being cut out. Just like that. As if Clara hadn't held my hand on her deathbed and whispered thank you for everything. As if those 38 years she'd worked herself tired in that school cafeteria kitchen meant nothing at all. Let me back up a bit, because you need to understand how we got to that moment in Mr. Ellison's office, and why it broke something in me that I didn't even know could still break at 76 years old. My name is Margaret Torres, though everyone who loves me calls me Maggie. I say everyone who loves me because these days that's a smaller circle than it used to be, and I've learned that's perfectly all right. Clara was my baby sister, younger than me by 4 years, and we grew up in a tiny apartment on the south side where Mama cleaned houses 6 days a week, so we could eat. Clara and I shared everything. A bedroom, a dresser with 3 drawers each, hand-me-down dresses that we altered with whatever fabric scraps Mama could find. We weren't poor in spirit, Mama used to say, just poor in dollars, and there's a difference. She taught us to hold our heads high and work honest. And both Clara and I took that to heart. Clara met Victor when she was 23. He came into the diner where she was waitressing, charmed her with stories about the auto repair shop he was going to open someday. And 6 months later they were married at the courthouse with me as witness. I remember thinking he had kind eyes back then. Or maybe I just wanted to believe he did because Clara looked so happy in her borrowed white dress. They never had children. Clara said it just wasn't in the cards for them. But she poured all that mothering love into her work at the elementary school cafeteria. 38 years she worked there, never missing a shift unless she was dying, and even then she called in herself. She knew every child's name, remembered their allergies, slipped extra fruit cups to the ones whose lunch accounts were empty. The kids loved her. The teachers loved her. She was the heart of that place. Victor's auto shop did get opened eventually, in a rundown garage on the east side. It struggled from the beginning. He was always short on cash, always borrowing from Clara's paychecks, always promising next month would be better. Clara never complained to me directly, but I noticed things. The way she'd check the bank balance twice before buying groceries. The way she'd say she wasn't hungry when we'd go out to lunch, then order the cheapest thing on the menu. The way Victor would interrupt her mid-sentence at family dinners, talking over her like she was furniture. I kept my mouth shut because that's what you did. You didn't interfere in someone else's marriage, but it sat heavy in my chest watching it. My own husband Robert passed 11 years ago from a heart attack, sudden and cruel. We'd had 34 good years together, raised 2 sons who moved out of state for work and call on holidays if they remember. After Robert died, Clara became my anchor. We'd meet every Tuesday for coffee at the bakery on Maple Street. And she'd tell me about the new lunch menu or the kindergartner who'd learned to tie his shoes. Simple things. Beautiful things. Those Tuesdays kept me going through the fog of widowhood. 3 years ago Clara called me on a Monday night instead of waiting for Tuesday. Her voice was small and scared in a way I'd never heard before. The doctors had found something during her routine checkup. Stage 3 ovarian cancer, already spreading. I remember sitting down hard on my kitchen floor. The phone pressed so tight to my ear it ached. She was crying softly, saying she was sorry, like getting sick was something she'd done wrong. I told her we'd fight it together, and I meant it with every cell in my body. The treatments were brutal. Chemo every other week at the cancer center 40 minutes away. Victor drove her the first 2 times, complaining the whole way about missing work, about the cost of gas, about the smell of the hospital making him sick. After that, I took over. I'd pick Clara up at 7 in the morning, and we'd make the drive in my old Honda, listening to the Golden Oldies station, and not talking about the cancer, unless she wanted to. Some days she'd cry. Some days she'd sleep. Some days she'd hold my hand and tell me about the life she'd wanted. Traveling to the beach, learning to paint, seeing the Grand Canyon. I'd tell her we'd do all of it once she beat this thing. And she'd smile at me with that knowing sadness that meant she didn't believe it but loved me for saying it anyway. I started staying at their house more and more as she got weaker. Cooking meals she could keep down, which wasn't much. Changing her bedsheets when the night sweats soaked them through. Helping her to the bathroom when she was too dizzy to walk alone. Victor was there, technically, but he was always in the garage or watching television or on his phone. He'd ask how she was doing in this distracted voice, like he was reading from a script, then disappear into his own world again. Clara would apologize for being a burden. Can you imagine? This woman who'd given everything to everyone her whole life, apologizing for being sick. About 6 months before she died, Clara asked me to come to an appointment with her lawyer, Mr. Ellison. He was an older gentleman who'd handled Clara's pension paperwork when she retired 2 years earlier. She'd worked long enough to qualify for a survivor benefit, a lump sum payout of $110,000 that would go to a designated beneficiary after her death. Clara told me, sitting in Mr. Ellison's office with the afternoon sun coming through the blinds, that she wanted me to be that beneficiary. Not Victor. Me. I started to protest, saying Victor was her husband and surely he should receive it, but she cut me off with a firmness I rarely heard from her. She said Victor had his shop and his own retirement account, small as it was. She said I'd taken care of Mama in her final years, paying for the assisted living out of my own savings when the boys couldn't help. She said I'd been there for her every single day of this nightmare, while Victor acted like her illness was an inconvenience. She said, and this part I'll never forget, Maggie, if anything happens to me, this is for you. You took care of Mama. Now let me take care of you. I cried right there in that lawyer's office, and Mr. Ellison quietly passed us both tissues. Clara signed the papers designating me as sole beneficiary on the pension survivor benefit. Victor wasn't mentioned. She didn't tell him about the change, and I didn't either. It felt like a secret we were keeping, though I couldn't have said from what or why. 2 months before Clara died, she asked Mr. Ellison to come to the house. I was there that day, making soup in the kitchen while she rested. Victor was at the shop. Clara was lucid despite the morphine, sharp-eyed and determined in a way that reminded me of Mama. She had Mr. Ellison bring some additional paperwork, and 2 hospice nurses who'd been caring for her signed as witnesses. I didn't know what it was about at the time. Clara just squeezed my hand afterward and said she'd taken care of something important. I assumed it was her will, or maybe final arrangements. I didn't press. Clara died on a Thursday morning in late September. I was holding her hand on one side of the bed, Victor on the other. She went peacefully, just slipped away between one breath and the next. Victor cried, loud and theatrical, calling her name. I just sat there numb, stroking her hair like I used to when we were girls and she'd had bad dreams. The funeral was small but lovely. The school sent flowers, so many flowers the funeral home ran out of vases. Former students, now grown, came to pay respects. Victor played the grieving husband, accepting condolences with wet eyes and humble nods. I stood in the corner, and felt like I was watching everything through water. Mr. Ellison called me 4 days after the funeral to schedule the reading of Clara's pension documents. His voice on the phone was gentle, professional, asking if the following Tuesday would work. I said yes, of course, though my hands were shaking as I wrote down the time. I hadn't told Victor about being the beneficiary. Some part of me kept waiting for the right moment, but the right moment never seemed to come. He was busy with funeral expenses and insurance claims and closing out Clara's accounts at the bank. He moved through the house like a ghost, opening cabinets and closing them, sorting through her things with this distant efficiency that made my stomach hurt. I'd been staying at their house since Clara passed, sleeping in the guest room, unable to face my own empty home just yet. Victor didn't ask me to leave, but he didn't ask me to stay either. We existed in the same space without really seeing each other, 2 people orbiting the same grief from different planets. He'd eat the casseroles I made without comment, leave his dishes in the sink, disappear into the garage for hours. I found myself tiptoeing around, trying to stay small and out of the way, though it was ridiculous at my age to feel like an intruder in my own sister's house. The night before the appointment with Mr. Ellison, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Clara's face when she'd signed those papers, the determination in her eyes. I kept hearing her voice, "This is for you." But doubt crept in the way it does at 3 in the morning when you're alone with your thoughts. Maybe I should have insisted Victor be included. Maybe it wasn't right to keep this from him. Maybe Clara had been confused from the medication and hadn't really meant to cut her husband out of something so significant. The guilt twisted in my chest until I finally got up and made tea, sitting at Clara's kitchen table in the dark, wondering what she would tell me to do if she were still here. Tuesday morning came gray and drizzling. I dressed carefully in my navy blue dress, the one I'd worn to Robert's funeral, because it felt appropriate somehow. Somber. Respectful. Victor came out of the bedroom wearing a suit I'd never seen before. Cheap, ill-fitting, but clearly purchased for the occasion. He smelled like aftershave and looked at me with this strange expression I couldn't quite read. Anticipation, maybe. Or something harder underneath. We drove separately to Mr. Ellison's office. I followed Victor's truck through the wet streets, my windshield wipers squeaking, my heart beating too fast. The office was in an old brick building downtown, the kind with high ceilings and creaking wood floors that made you feel like you'd stepped back in time. Mr. Ellison's secretary showed us into his office, offered coffee that neither of us wanted, then left us alone in the leather chairs facing his massive oak desk. Mr. Ellison arrived exactly on time, carrying a folder with Clara's name written on the tab. He was probably 70 himself, with white hair and reading glasses that sat low on his nose. He'd known Clara for decades, handled her retirement paperwork, treated her with a kindness that made me trust him instinctively. He sat down, opened the folder, and began to explain the pension survivor benefit process in that calm, measured way lawyers have of making complicated things sound simple. Victor listened for maybe 3 minutes before he interrupted, leaned forward in his chair, laced his fingers together like he was about to negotiate a car repair, and said I didn't need the money. Said Clara had told him, though I knew she absolutely hadn't, that the pension should support the family business. Said he'd be handling things from here, and I should understand that. His voice was reasonable, almost kind, like he was doing me a favor by taking this burden off my hands. I sat frozen. The words landed on me like physical blows, one after another, knocking the air from my lungs. This was Victor, who'd let me drive Clara to chemo for 2 years while he complained about losing business. Victor, who'd watched me cook and clean and hold his dying wife's hand through the worst moments of her life without ever once saying thank you. Victor, who was now sitting in this lawyer's office 3 weeks after burying her, telling me with that practiced smile that I was being erased from her final gift to me. Mr. Ellison had gone very still. He was watching Victor with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between pity and distaste. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to say that Clara had chosen me deliberately and Victor knew nothing about what she'd wanted. But my throat had closed up tight. I was that little girl again, watching Mama get yelled at by landlords and bill collectors, learning that sometimes the best thing to do was stay quiet and small and not make it worse. Victor kept talking, filling the silence with justifications. How he'd need to expand the shop now that Clara's income was gone. How I had my social security and the house Robert left me. So what did I need with $110,000 anyway? How Clara would have wanted him taken care of. Would have wanted the business to survive. He said it all so smoothly, like he'd rehearsed it, and maybe he had. Maybe he'd been planning this moment since before Clara even died, just waiting for the chance. I looked down at my hands in my lap. They were old hands, spotted with age, the wedding ring from Robert still on my finger after all these years. I thought about Clara's hands, how thin they'd gotten at the end, how the veins had shown through like blue rivers under paper. I thought about how she'd held mine that day in Mr. Ellison's office and told me she was taking care of me. I thought about the secret she'd kept, the papers she'd signed 2 months before dying, the witnesses who'd watched her do it. Mr. Ellison cleared his throat. The sound cut through Victor's monologue like a knife. He said very quietly, very calmly, that there was actually something Victor should know. Said there was an addendum to the pension documents that Clara had filed shortly before her passing. He said it in that careful lawyer voice that gave nothing away, but I saw something flicker in his eyes when he looked at me. Something that might have been reassurance. Victor laughed. Actually laughed, this short bark of disbelief. Said Clara had been on morphine half the time, barely knew what day it was, couldn't possibly have filed any legitimate paperwork. Said it dismissively, Like Mr. Ellison was making things up or had been fooled by a confused dying woman. The arrogance of it made something hot rise in my chest. Not quite anger yet, but getting there. Mr. Ellison didn't respond to the laughter. He simply reached into the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, slid it across the desk toward Victor with 2 fingers, like he was serving papers in a courtroom. The movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. I watched Victor's face as he picked it up and started reading. Victor's face went white as he read Clara's handwritten addendum. I watched the color drain from his cheeks like water down a sink, watched his eyes move across the page once, twice, 3 times as if reading it again might change what the words said. His hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled, and I realized I'd never seen him look truly afraid before. Angry, yes. Frustrated, certainly. But not this. Not this raw panic of a man watching his carefully constructed plan collapse in real time. Mr. Ellison sat perfectly still behind his desk, his hands folded, his expression neutral in that way lawyers have perfected. He wasn't gloating, but he wasn't sympathetic either. He was simply there, a witness to the moment Clara had orchestrated from beyond the grave, making sure her final wishes were carried out exactly as she'd intended. The office felt smaller suddenly, the air thick with tension and the ghost of my sister's determination. Victor's voice came out strangled when he finally spoke. Said this wasn't real, couldn't be real, that Clara wouldn't do this to him. He kept saying to me, like he was the victim in all of this, like he was the one who'd been wronged. The audacity of it would have been funny if it hadn't made me so quietly, deeply angry. This was the same man who'd let me shoulder every burden of Clara's illness alone. The same man who'd complained about hospital smells while his wife was dying. And now he had the nerve to act betrayed, because she'd protected me from exactly what he was trying to do. Mr. Ellison let him sputter for a moment before speaking. His voice was calm, measured, almost gentle, which somehow made what he was saying more devastating. He explained that Clara had come to his office 2 months before her death, lucid and determined despite the pain medication. That she'd specifically requested this addendum be added to the pension documents. That 2 hospice nurses had witnessed her signature, and had provided written statements confirming she'd been completely aware of what she was doing and why. Victor slammed the paper down on the desk, making me jump. Said the nurses must have been mistaken, that Clara had been confused, that morphine did things to people's minds and this couldn't possibly be legitimate. He was getting louder, more desperate, his carefully maintained composure cracking like old paint. I sat frozen in my chair, my purse clutched in my lap, watching this man I'd known for over 40 years reveal himself completely. There was no charm left, no practiced smile. Just naked greed and fury that someone had dared to tell him no. Mr. Ellison pulled another document from the folder. This one was typed, official-looking, with a notary seal at the bottom. He slid it across the desk next to Clara's handwritten addendum, and explained in that same calm voice that the hospice had required a competency evaluation before allowing Clara to make any legal changes. A doctor had assessed her, confirmed she was of sound mind, documented the entire conversation. The evaluation was attached, complete with the doctor's signature and notes about Clara's clarity, her firm understanding of what she was doing, her specific reasons for the addendum. I couldn't see the document from where I sat, but I watched Victor's eyes scan it, watched his face go from white to red, watched a vein start pulsing in his temple. He looked up at Mr. Ellison with something like hatred and said the whole thing was a setup, that someone had influenced Clara, poisoned her against him. He didn't look at me when he said it, but we both knew who he meant. The accusation hung in the air between us, ugly and desperate. For the first time since we'd sat down, I found my voice. It came out quieter than I expected but steady, and I said simply that no one had needed to poison Clara against anyone, that she'd made her own choices based on what she'd lived through and what she'd observed. I said it without anger, just stating a fact, and somehow that seemed to enrage Victor more than if I'd screamed at him. He turned on me then, really looked at me for the first time in that office. His eyes were wild, searching my face for something, guilt, maybe, or satisfaction, or fear he could exploit. But I'd had a year of watching my sister die to learn how to keep my face calm when everything inside me was churning. I looked back at him steadily, this man who'd dismissed me as insignificant for decades, and I didn't blink. Mr. Ellison cleared his throat and continued as if Victor hadn't interrupted. He explained that the addendum was crystal clear in its terms. If Victor attempted to redirect, contest, or exclude me from any part of the survivor benefit, the entire pension payout would instead go to the Clara Torres Memorial Fund for single mothers returning to education. The fund would be administered solely by me. Victor would receive exactly $0. The pension board had already reviewed and approved the terms. Everything was legal, binding, and final. Victor stood up so fast his chair scraped across the floor with a sound like a scream. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, and for a second I thought he might actually do something physical. But Mr. Ellison stood too, and despite being an older man himself, there was something in his posture that said he wouldn't tolerate any nonsense. Victor seemed to recognize this because he stepped back, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He said we'd tricked her, that this was elder abuse, that he'd fight it. His voice was shaking, all the smooth reasonableness from earlier completely gone. Mr. Ellison told him calmly that he was welcome to consult his own attorney, but that the documents were ironclad and any challenge would be expensive and ultimately unsuccessful. That Clara had been very thorough in her planning, had anticipated exactly this reaction, and had made sure there were no loopholes. That's when Victor seemed to finally understand. I watched it happen, watched the moment the reality settled into his bones. His shoulders sagged. His jaw went slack. He looked at the papers on the desk, at Mr. Ellison's impassive face, and finally at me. Really, truly looked at me for maybe the first time in all the years he'd known me. I saw him see me, not as Clara's useful sister who drove her to appointments and cooked meals and stayed out of the way, but as a person Clara had loved enough to protect even in death. His eyes were wide with something that might have been understanding, or might have been just pure panic. The floor had disappeared beneath him and he was falling, and there was no one to catch him because he'd spent 42 years making sure no one cared enough to try. I didn't yell, didn't gloat, didn't even smile. I just said very softly, what Clara had taught me our whole lives. That family takes care of family. That real love means protecting the people who matter, not using them. That he'd forgotten that part, and now he was learning what forgetting cost. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, maybe apologize, maybe curse me, maybe beg, but nothing came out. Just a sound like air leaving a tire. Then he turned and walked out of that office, his cheap suit jacket hanging wrong on his shoulders, his whole body radiating defeat. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Through the window I heard his truck start up, heard the engine rev too hard, heard the squeal of tires as he pulled out of the parking lot too fast. Mr. Ellison sat back down slowly, and looked at me with something that might have been respect. He told me the check would be ready within a week. Asked if I had any questions about the memorial fund, about the administration, about next steps. His voice was kind now, grandfatherly, like he understood this had been harder than I was letting on. I shook my head, thanked him for everything he'd done for Clara, for me. Told him my sister had been lucky to have an attorney who actually cared. I stood up to leave, my legs steadier than I expected. At the door I turned back and asked Mr. Ellison if Clara had said anything when she signed the addendum, anything he could share. He was quiet for a moment, then told me she'd said two things. First, that Maggie never asked for anything, and Victor always did. And second, that if Victor tried to take what was mine, he deserved to learn what it felt like to have nothing. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. That was Clara, gentle until you pushed her, and then fierce in ways that surprised people who thought kindness meant weakness. She'd been fierce for me when I couldn't be fierce for myself, and she'd done it knowing she wouldn't be there to see it happen. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind replaying Victor's face over and over. The shock, the rage, the dawning horror of consequences. Part of me still couldn't believe it had happened, that Clara had really done this, that I was really free of him. But the papers in my purse were real, and the empty passenger seat where Clara used to sit was real, and the future stretching out in front of me was real. The days after that meeting in Mr. Ellison's office passed in a strange kind of stillness, like the world had gone quiet just so I could hear myself think clearly for the first time in years. I moved back into my own house that same afternoon, packed up my things from Clara's guest room while Victor was still wherever he'd gone after storming out. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye. I just gathered my clothes and my toiletries and the framed photo of Clara and me at the beach from when we were young. And I drove home through streets that looked different somehow, sharper and more real than they'd seemed in months. My house felt empty when I walked in, but it was my emptiness, and there was comfort in that. I made myself tea and sat in Robert's old recliner by the window, watching the neighbor's cat hunt sparrows in the garden. And I let myself cry. Not sad tears exactly, though there was sadness mixed in for Clara, and for the years I'd wasted worrying about Victor's feelings. These were cleaner tears, the kind that wash things away instead of drowning you. I cried until I was empty. Then I made myself dinner, just scrambled eggs and toast, nothing fancy, and I ate every bite. Mr. Ellison called the next morning to tell me the pension check would be processed within the week. He said it again like he wanted to make absolutely sure I understood that the Clara Torres Memorial Fund was being established exactly as my sister had specified. He said the paperwork was ironclad, that Victor had no legal standing to contest it, and that I should feel completely secure in moving forward. His voice was warm, almost fatherly, and I thanked him with a steadiness that surprised me. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and started writing down ideas for the scholarship fund. What Clara would have wanted. Who she would have wanted to help. Single mothers going back to school. Women trying to build better lives for their children. The kind of women Clara had served lunch to their kids for 38 years. The ones she'd worried about. The ones who reminded her of our own mama. I didn't hear from Victor. Not a phone call, not a text, not a word through the few mutual acquaintances we had. It was like he'd vanished, and I was grateful for it. I needed the space to grieve my sister properly, without his presence contaminating everything. I went through old photo albums, read cards Clara had sent me over the years, listened to a voicemail she'd left me 2 months before she died just saying she loved me. I let myself remember the good things. Our Tuesday coffee dates, the way she'd laugh at terrible jokes, how she'd hum while she cooked. The Victor-shaped hole in those memories got smaller and smaller until it was barely there at all. But word travels in small towns, especially when money and family drama are involved. My neighbor Helen, who knew everyone and everything, stopped by one afternoon with a casserole I didn't need and information I didn't ask for. She told me, in that breathless way people have when they're bursting with gossip, that Victor's auto shop was struggling even worse than usual, that he'd been counting on Clara's pension to keep it afloat, maybe even expand like he'd been promising for years, that he'd already talked to contractors about renovations, already made promises to creditors that he'd have the money soon. Helen said it with wide eyes and a shake of her head, like she couldn't believe anyone could be so foolish. I listened politely, thanked her for the casserole, and closed the door feeling nothing at all. No satisfaction, no vindication, just a kind of distant observation like watching weather happen somewhere far away. Victor's problems weren't mine anymore. They never really had been, I realized. I just convinced myself they were because Clara was tangled up in them, and I couldn't separate the two. But Clara was gone now, and what she'd left behind wasn't entanglement, it was freedom. The pension check arrived on a Thursday, delivered by certified mail that required my signature. $110,000, made out to Margaret Torres. I held it in my hands in my quiet kitchen, and thought about all the things that money represented. Clara's 38 years of waking up at 5 in the morning, her aching feet from standing on cafeteria floors, her patience with difficult children and difficult administrators, and a difficult husband, her choice at the very end, to protect me the way I'd tried to protect her. I deposited it that afternoon and started the process of setting up the memorial fund. More news filtered through over the following weeks, though I tried not to pay attention. Victor had apparently shown up at the pension board office demanding to speak to someone about Clara's documents, insisting there'd been a mistake, that his wife couldn't have meant to exclude him. They'd sent him away with copies of everything Clara had signed, every witness statement, every piece of proof that she'd been completely lucid and completely certain. He'd tried calling Mr. Ellison's office repeatedly, leaving increasingly desperate messages that went unreturned because there was nothing left to discuss. The addendum Clara had filed was legal, binding and final. I heard through Helen that he'd had to let go of his only employee, a young man who'd worked for him for 5 years, that he was behind on the rent for the garage space, that he'd stopped showing up at the diner where he used to eat breakfast every morning because he couldn't afford it anymore. Part of me, a very small part that remembered the young man who'd charmed my sister at that diner so long ago, felt sorry for him. But the larger part, the part that had watched him dismiss Clara's pain and ignore her sacrifices and then try to steal her final gift to me, felt nothing but a quiet certainty that this was exactly what happened when you treated people like they were disposable. I drove past his shop once, not on purpose but because it was on the way to the grocery store I'd always used. The lights were off even though it was a Tuesday afternoon. The sign that usually said open was turned around. There was a notice taped to the window, probably from the landlord, fluttering in the breeze. I didn't slow down to read it. I just kept driving, and when I got to the store I bought fresh flowers for my kitchen table, the kind Clara used to love, bright yellow daisies that looked like sunshine. At home that evening, I arranged the flowers in a vase and set them where I could see them from the living room. I thought about Victor alone in that dark shop, maybe finally understanding what it felt like to be cut out and dismissed. I thought about karma and consequences and whether Clara had known, really known, that he would try exactly what he'd tried. Of course she had. She'd lived with him for 42 years. She'd known him better than anyone, including himself. The first scholarship from the Clara Torres Memorial Fund went to a woman named Rosa Mendez. She was 34 years old with 3 children under 10, working 2 part-time jobs while trying to finish her nursing degree at the community college. I met her in Mr. Ellison's office on a bright morning in March, 6 months after Clara had died, and when I told her she'd been selected to receive the scholarship, she started crying so hard she couldn't speak. Just sat there in the chair across from me with her hands over her face, shoulders shaking, making these small sounds of disbelief and relief all mixed together. I reached across and touched her arm gently, told her to take her time, that there was nowhere else I needed to be. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes red and grateful, she said she'd been about to drop out. Said the cost of textbooks and lab fees and childcare was drowning her. That she'd been lying awake every night trying to figure out how to make impossible math work. Said this scholarship meant she could finish, could graduate, could give her children the life she'd been dreaming about. I told her about Clara, about the cafeteria and the kids she'd fed and the quiet ways she'd noticed who needed help. Rosa said she remembered a cafeteria lady like that from her own elementary school, someone who'd slipped her extra milk when her lunch account was empty, and maybe it had even been Clara. We both cried then, and it felt good, like watering something that had been too dry for too long. Setting up the fund had given me purpose in those gray winter months when grief might have swallowed me whole. I worked with Mr. Ellison and a financial advisor to structure everything properly, to make sure the money would stretch as far as possible while still making a real difference. We decided on 3 scholarships a year, each one enough to cover tuition and fees and books for a full semester. It wasn't everything, but it was something substantial, something that could change the trajectory of a life. Clara would have loved that. The practicality of it, the tangible help instead of empty gestures. I joined the community college scholarship committee, so I could help review applications myself. Every Tuesday morning, the same day Clara and I used to meet for coffee, I'd drive to the college and sit in a conference room with 3 other volunteers, reading through stories of women trying to build better futures. Single mothers escaping bad situations. Widows starting over after losing spouses. Immigrants learning new trades. Each application was a small window into a life, and I read them with the same attention Clara had given to remembering every child's name and allergies. When we selected the recipients each semester, I felt her presence so strongly it was like she was sitting right beside me, nodding approval. My Tuesdays became sacred again, but in a different way than before. After the scholarship committee meetings, I'd stop at the bakery on Maple Street where Clara and I used to go. I'd order her favorite, a blueberry scone and chamomile tea, and I'd sit at our usual table by the window and tell her about the women we'd chosen to help. I'd talk to her out loud, quietly, not caring if anyone thought I was a crazy old lady talking to herself. I'd tell her about Rose's tears, about the woman studying to be a dental hygienist, about the one going back for her teaching certificate at 53. I'd tell her that her gift was multiplying, blooming into something beautiful, and I could almost hear her laughing that soft laugh she had. The one that meant she was pleased but too humble to say so. Spring came, and with it a restlessness I hadn't felt in years. I started taking walks every morning. Nothing strenuous, just around the neighborhood while the world was waking up. I noticed things I'd stopped seeing. The way Mr. Patterson's roses climbed his fence in impossible shades of pink, the family of robins that nested in my maple tree every year, the sound of children laughing on their way to school. I'd been so focused on caretaking for so long, first Robert in his final illness, then Mama in the assisted living facility, then Clara through cancer, that I'd forgotten how to just exist in the world without someone needing me. My sons called more often that spring, maybe sensing something different in my voice. David, the older one in Seattle, invited me to come visit for a week in June. I almost said no out of habit. Too expensive, too much trouble, I'd just be in the way. But then I thought about Clara telling me to let her take care of me, and I said yes instead. Matthew, my younger boy in Denver, did the same for August, and I said yes to that too. When I hung up the phone after making those plans, I felt something unfamiliar and wonderful spreading through my chest. Anticipation. Joy. The sense that there was still life left to live, still things I wanted to see and do. I started going through the house room by room, sorting through decades of accumulation. Not in a morbid way, not preparing to die, but making space for whatever came next. I donated Robert's old tools that had been gathering dust in the garage. I packed up boxes of clothes I'd been saving for occasions that never came. I found the watercolor set I'd bought myself years ago and never opened, and I set it up on the kitchen table one rainy afternoon, and painted for 3 hours straight. The paintings weren't good, clumsy trees and lopsided flowers, but they were mine, and making them felt like opening a window in a room that had been closed too long. Helen invited me to join her book club, and I went. 8 women meeting once a month to discuss novels and drink wine and laugh about things that had nothing to do with sickness or death or family obligation. I was nervous the first time, worried I wouldn't fit in, but they welcomed me with warmth that reminded me there was still kindness in the world if you were willing to reach for it. We read mysteries and romances and memoirs, and I discovered I had opinions about books I'd never bothered to form before. I discovered I had a voice that people listened to when I spoke. The second round of scholarships went out in the fall, and this time I felt only joy, no grief mixed in. 3 more women getting chances they'd almost given up on. 3 more futures shifted slightly toward possibility. Mr. Ellison told me the fund was attracting attention, that people were asking how to donate to it, how to support Clara's legacy. I said yes to that too. Let it grow beyond just the original pension money. Let other people join in the giving. I thought less and less about Victor as the months passed. Heard through the grapevine that he'd sold the auto shop, or lost it. I wasn't clear on the details and didn't ask for clarification. Heard he'd moved out of the house he'd shared with Clara, downsized to an apartment somewhere on the other side of town. It was information that washed over me without sticking, like rain on glass. His life and mine had finally, completely separated, and the relief of that was immense. On the first anniversary of Clara's death, I woke before dawn without meaning to. The house was quiet and dark, and for a moment I lay there in bed thinking about that Thursday morning a year ago when she'd slipped away holding my hand. The pain of losing her was still there, would always be there, but it had transformed into something softer, something I could carry without it crushing me. Grief had become a companion instead of a captor, walking beside me instead of sitting on my chest. I got up and made coffee, then sat at the kitchen table watching the sun come up through my window. I'd placed Clara's photo there, the one of us at the beach when we were young, both of us squinting into the camera with wind-blown hair and genuine smiles. We'd been so hopeful then, so certain that life would be kind if we just worked hard enough and loved fully enough. Life hadn't been kind, not always, but we'd had each other, and that had been enough. More than enough. I drove to the cemetery that morning with a bouquet of yellow daisies, the ones she'd loved. Her headstone was simple, just her name and dates and the words "beloved sister," that I'd insisted on. Victor's name wasn't there. He'd chosen not to be buried beside her when the time came, Mr. Ellison had told me. Though whether that was pride or shame or simply practicality, I didn't know and didn't care. I arranged the flowers in the built-in vase, pulled a few weeds that had sprouted around the edges, and sat down on the grass beside her. I talked to her the way I always did at the cemetery, out loud and unashamed. Told her about the 6 women who'd received scholarships so far, their names and their dreams and how grateful they'd been. Told her about my trips to see the boys, how David's daughter, my granddaughter Emily, had taught me to use video calls so we could talk every week now. Told her about the watercolors I'd been painting, how I'd even framed one and hung it in the hallway, something I never would have had the courage to do before. Told her I was learning, slowly, to take up space in my own life, to believe I deserved good things without having to earn them through endless sacrifice. I told her too, in a whisper, about the day I'd driven past the old house, the one she and Victor had shared. There was a different car in the driveway, different curtains in the windows. A young family, Helen had told me, with 2 small children who rode tricycles on the sidewalk. The house had moved on without either of them, the way houses do, becoming someone else's story. I'd felt nothing but a distant gladness that children were growing up there now. That laughter was filling those rooms again. "You knew," I said to Clara's headstone, running my fingers over her carved name. "You knew exactly what he'd tried to do, and you protected me anyway. Even when you were dying, even when you had every right to think only of yourself, you were thinking of me." The wind moved through the trees around the cemetery, and I let myself believe it was her answering. Let myself believe she could hear me and was glad I'd finally understood what she'd tried to tell me all along. That I was worthy of being cared for. That my lifetime of quiet giving had value. That choosing myself wasn't selfish but necessary. I'd seen Victor once since that day in Mr. Ellison's office, purely by accident at the grocery store 3 months ago. He'd been in the checkout line 2 registers over, and I'd recognized the slope of his shoulders before I saw his face. He looked older, grayer, diminished somehow. He'd glanced up and our eyes met for just a second, and I'd seen something flicker there, shame, maybe, or resentment, or just the dull acceptance of consequences finally arrived. I'd looked away first, not out of fear or discomfort, but because there was simply nothing left between us that required acknowledgement. He was a stranger who'd once been married to my sister, and that was all he'd ever be to me now. I heard later that he'd taken a job as a mechanic at someone else's shop, working for hourly wages after decades of being his own boss. Part of me, the part that Clara had taught to be compassionate, hoped he was managing all right. But the larger part, the part that had finally learned to honor my own worth, knew that his struggles were the natural result of his choices, just as my current peace was the result of Clara's love and my own slow journey toward self-respect. The scholarship fund had taken on a life of its own by that first anniversary. Small donations had started coming in from former students of Clara's, teachers who'd worked with her, parents whose children she'd fed and cared for. The local newspaper had run a story about it, and a women's organization had reached out about partnering to expand the program. Mr. Ellison and I were meeting monthly now to discuss the fund's growth, its future, how to honor Clara's intention while letting it evolve into something even bigger than we'd originally imagined. I'd become friends with several of the scholarship recipients, staying in touch as they progressed through their programs. Rosa had invited me to her graduation in May, and I'd sat in the audience crying proud tears as she walked across that stage in her cap and gown, her 3 children cheering wildly from the front row. She'd found me afterward, introduced me to her kids, told them I was the angel who'd made it possible. I'd corrected her gently, told them their mother was the angel, that all I'd done was pass along a gift from another angel named Clara who'd believed in women like us. At 76, I was building a life I'd never imagined having. Book club on the first Thursday of every month. Watercolor class on Saturday mornings at the community center. Video calls with Emily where she showed me her drawings and told me about school. Volunteer work with the scholarship committee, and occasionally at the elementary school where Clara had worked. Reading to kindergartners who reminded me why she'd loved that job so much. Simple pleasures that added up to something rich and full and mine. I stood up from beside Clara's grave, my knees protesting slightly, and brushed the grass from my pants. The sun was fully up now, warm on my face, promising a beautiful September day. I touched her headstone one more time, a gentle goodbye until next month, and walked back to my car with steady steps. Driving home, I thought about all the years I'd spent making myself small, apologizing for existing, putting everyone else's needs before my own. I thought about how Clara's final act of love had been to force me to accept something I couldn't refuse, to take care of myself the way I'd spent a lifetime taking care of others. She'd known I'd never have done it on my own, so she'd done it for me, and in doing so had given me permission to finally bloom. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment looking at my little house with its garden I was learning to tend, and its rooms I was slowly making beautiful. This was mine. This life, this peace, this freedom to choose joy. Clara had given it to me with her last breath, and I was going to honor that gift by living it fully, unapologetically, for however many years I had left. I was worthy of love. I was worthy of rest. I was worthy of my sister's final sacrifice. And finally, at 76 years young, I believed it.